Today I'd like to look at the idea of the philosophy of life. So I assume that each person essentially has a philosophy of life. You could call that a world view or a self-world view. So I would say that philosophy is basically a process of self-reflection. So that means everybody at some level reflects on their life as a whole. So you could say we each reflect on our past in terms of the present and the future. So we're reflecting, in a sense, we're by implication, thinking about ourselves as a whole. So inwardly and outwardly, in our feelings, in our expectations, in what's happened in the past, all of the activity of consciousness in the world is being reflected upon. So that's what I would call the making of the philosophy of life. A philosopher is a lover of truth, or a lover of wisdom. So, you know, in a sense you might say you want to know the truth about your life. You want to be wise to your life. What they call right wise. You want to get things right, you want to be in order, you want to tell the truth to yourself and to other people, if that matters to you. And also, just as you want to have an understanding of your whole life, the meaning of your life, then if you're actually a practicing philosopher, what used to be called a natural philosopher, then you're naturally interested in how things work as a whole. You know, in other words, what's the nature of reality? So in the ancient world, someone like Plato, who you might say, in one sense, was the father of philosophy, he thought about and wrote about every subject. So in those days, the mythology would be that the muses, the 9 muses, they were the inspirations in the psyche that gave birth to the various faculties or perceptions in what we call the field of knowledge. For instance, history, astronomy, poetry, music. So what we call education in general is, you might say, a product of the muses, is a product of Greek thought. So a philosopher is just a person that reflects on the whole of life, the whole of reality, not just subjectively, personally, as we all do, but in a much more particular way of focusing attention, for example, on the contemplation of what is reality, the contemplation in Plato's sense on what is the one. So Plato's idea would be that the one is the ground of all being, the one is the source of creation, the one is the absolute source of reality. That would be the basic Platonic idea. And that was carried on later by his follower, Plotinus, and he developed the idea of the one, and then he said that the next level down from the one would be the intelligible realm. And that would be probably the archetypal realm. So that would be the realm of the intelligences, you might say. What I would call the spiritual perceptions. So in Tibetan Buddhism you'd have the one mind, which is Buddhahood, which is nirvana, which is shunyata, emptiness, the body of wisdom, the diamond body, and Buddhahood, or the Buddha essence. So in Tibetan Buddhism, you would meditate or contemplate the nature of your own Buddha nature, what the Zen call your self-nature. So they would see philosophy not in abstract terms, not in terms of the material universe and what caused the material universe, and look for some abstract principles, what are called the Platonic forms, or the archetypal forms. In Tibetan Buddhism, you would meditate on your own nature as the Buddha nature. So in other words, the one is accessible to each individual in terms of meditation. So you can reflect not only on, say, the philosophy of life in terms of your subjective history, your subjective life, but you can also meditate on your true self. So the distinction would be made between the ego-bound consciousness, which is the ordinary consciousness that we function within the world. So in a cultural sense, in a creative sense of music and art, and how we work out our relationships, how we function in the world, in culture, in society, psychologically, etc., would be ego-bound consciousness, or the consciousness of identity. So you would have to distinguish between that and the true self. That would be the meditation. So once you have insight into the fact that there is such a thing as an ego-bound consciousness, then that means that you would be looking or contemplating something else beside that. Now you can bring in the idea of introspection or going into the interior, which would be like the Jungian Psyche. So in the Jungian Psyche, you would access various altered states or states of mind, which is very prevalent in levels of meditation. And so if for example you meditated on a mandala, then the mandala would be a kind of symbolic structure that you would meditate on in your psyche, in the sense that you would, in a sense, leave your body and you would go into the nature of the mandala. So the mandala would have, say, Buddha at its center. So that's your goal, is to find out the Buddha nature of your own self. So you would contemplate that in terms of the Buddha in the center, and then in the four corners of the square of the mandala, you would have four other Buddhas, and they would represent various aspects or faculties of spiritual perception. So that means when you go into the psyche, as it were, you access deeper level perception. So if you're a scientist and you're using knowledge to gain understanding of, say, the quantum field, in order to go deeper, you have to have an insight into that structure. So in Tibetan Buddhism they call that Boudic Insight. So Boudic Insight or Enlightened Insight is the third eye. So the Buddhas, in effect, the Buddhas of meditation that make up the mandala, they wear the Buddha eye, the eye of Buddha. So they've all got Boudic Insight, which again I would translate as subtle spiritual perceptions. So you might say, as you deepen your awareness of the psyche in altered states, etc., etc., you understand what I would call the symbolic code. You understand how the psyche works in symbols, and symbols are the symbols of religion and mythology. So you have the gods, and you have all the entities that make up the pantheon of the gods, or the gods of mythology. So in the psyche you're really working with symbols. So the mandala is a symbol, the image of Buddha is a symbol, the image of the third eye is a symbol. So through a meditation, you might say, of the psyche, you can access higher level spiritual perceptions that are in the spiritual dimension. So from the spiritual dimension, from the archetypal dimension, the intelligible realm, the realm of intelligence, then that manifests in the psyche as a symbol. So when you see the eye of the Buddha, then through that understanding symbolically, you access the third eye of spiritual perception. So in a sense, as you're looking at the mandala, as you integrate the four corners, as it were, and make it whole, the Buddha at the center represents wholeness. As you meditate on that, just as you meditate on the quantum field, you gain insight into the symbolic nature of the mandala, into the symbolic nature of the quantum field. Because it's all taking place in your psyche. It's all theoretically in your psyche. So that means the insight isn't coming from the symbol. The insight's not coming from the physical body or consciousness or the psyche. The insight's coming from the spiritual perception through meditating on the symbol, through meditating on the quantum field. You harness a spiritual insight which shows that you're using the third eye. That's how it would work. So at a certain level of contemplation and meditation, you awaken the spiritual perceptions of compassion, love, beauty, truth, all-discriminating wisdom, mirror-like wisdom, all the higher qualities that are, you might say, the essence of consciousness. So in the field of consciousness, the ego-bound consciousness, as we function in the world, we have limited understandings of love, limited understandings of justice. So through consciousness, you can't perfect justice, you can't perfect love, you can't perfect truth. So through the medium of culture, you can't make the world whole. You can't make your relationship with other people whole. You can't make the world one. And the Rosicrucian Gerhard Dorn, he said that unless you make one of yourself, you can't make one of the world. So he's referring, unless you become the Buddha nature, unless you discover your true self, your true spiritual nature, you can't emanate love, beauty, truth and justice in the world. So meditation and contemplation are really in terms of the philosopher and the mystic, they're subtle spiritual perceptions. In other words, you can't really go beyond the physical and the psychic unless you have awakened the spiritual perceptions, which is really opening the third eye, the eye of Buddha. So someone like Einstein, he was very interested in the mystery of the universe. Although he was studying the material universe, he was a spiritual person who felt that there was a supreme being, there was God, in a sense, beyond the physical universe. And he said the most comprehensible thing about the universe is its incomprehensibility. So in other words, the truth about the universe is its mystery, or the truth about reality is God. So God is the source of reality, as it were, or the Buddha nature is the source of truth. The difference between knowledge and wisdom is that knowledge is to know something. You might say the scientist knows about the quantum field, but wisdom is using that knowledge in an insightful way. So Boudic Insight, Enlightened Insight, is also intuitive wisdom. So if you're in relationship to another person and say there's a difficulty that your character and another person's character are in conflict or disagreement, and one of you won't change in order to deepen the love, understand the nature of love between two people, and there's a resistance, there's a friction, there's a conflict, and usually people in that state will break up, they won't go any further. So you could say there's a limit in people's understanding of their relationship, just like there's a limit in the scientists' understanding of the Big Bang. You know, how did that happen? What's beyond the Big Bang? Is there anything beyond the Big Bang? So they invent the string theory of multi-dimensions, or the idea of multi-universes. So in other words, in consciousness, you're always using knowledge and you're always coming up against a limit. So in the field of consciousness, in the field of the psyche, and in the field of the physical universe, you might say that field is infinite. So the psyche and the physical, they're infinite. So you could say there's infinite knowledge. And each time you reach a point of resistance, then you have to have a breakthrough. So if you have a resistance in a relationship, you've got to have an insight where you get a breakthrough. Now, if you're wise, you use your intuitive wisdom and you have another breakthrough, another breakthrough, another breakthrough. So until two people learn to not only empathize, but understand that unless they keep on looking with insight and understanding, they won't discover love. And in discovering love, you're discovering your true self. And the self is one. So even though two selves, two people, two selves are in essence one, in their consciousness they're in division, they're in friction. So in order for the two people, their self, to be in harmony, to be in union, to be at one with each other, they have to work out the problem within consciousness that's separating them. And in order to do that, they need to gain insight into what's dividing them, the problem in their psychology, the problem in their emotions, the problem in their character, what they've inherited, etc., etc. So you might say in the field of the psyche, in the field of the physical universe, the way we work at that field, those two fields, is through the field of knowledge. So in consciousness we investigate using knowledge and experience, and we go deeper and deeper into the physical universe. And like Carl Jung, he went deeper and deeper into the psyche, and he said that beyond the psyche, or the deepest level of the psyche, what he called the psychology of the unconscious, was the collective unconscious, and he termed that the psychoid, which is the archetypal realm. Now I would say, instead of calling that the deeper level of the psyche, I would call that the spiritual domain, so that the archetypes are really the intelligible principles. They're the intelligences, the spiritual perceptions of the Buddhas of meditation. So Jung saw the archetype, or the archetypes, as forms of perception. So he did actually see that they were forms of perception. And he also realized that the archetypes, you might say, they organize the fields of knowledge within the psyche and the physical, so that when you're using your consciousness and you might say you're accessing the archetypal perceptions, then you can work out any problem you like within the physical and the psyche, because the psychoid contains, in a sense, contains both the physical and the psychic. So in other words, the unconscious, or the psychoid, it enfolds both the psychic and the physical. And when the archetype perceives through consciousness the psyche and the physical, then that would be the synchronistic field that in a sense holds the two together. So you have a synchronicity in a dream, and you have a synchronicity in your daily life. So synchronicity really is, you might say, the interface or the intercommunication between the inner psyche and the outer physical world. So that you might say the archetype, really, what he said, the archetype has absolute knowledge. So in the intelligible realm, in the realm of the Buddhas of meditation, in the realm, you might say, of the third eye, you have absolute knowledge of what's in the psyche and what's in the physical. So that means that with intuitive wisdom you can penetrate and gain insight into any form of knowledge that you wish. So again, you might say the essence of knowledge is wisdom. For example, if you're playing the piano, and say you're playing someone like Mozart, so you pick up a score of Mozart, you pick up a piece of music by Mozart, and you sit down at the piano. And what you want to do as a pianist, you want to translate into music what you feel the essence of that music was for Mozart. So Mozart composed that piece of music, and Mozart, the composer, was inspired to write that music. There was a kind of an essence, you might say, of insight that produced the music, the creation, the creativity of the genius, as it were, created that piece of music to bring into being, into the physical and into the psychic, into consciousness itself, bring in, you might say, the wisdom of the spiritual level, the spiritual perceptions, and the archetypal emanations, as it were. So the archetypal emanations of the spiritual perceptions in terms of the Buddhas of meditation, because Mozart has to be in meditation in order to gain insight. So meditation isn't about altered states of mind. Meditation isn't about knowledge and levels of knowledge. Meditation is coming out of the one, which is pure meditation, emptiness, without any limit. It's eternal. So when you look into the psyche, which is infinite, into the physical, which is infinite, based on knowledge, you're bringing into being the eternality of Boudic Insight, the eternality of the one. So if Mozart's accessed the spiritual perceptions, then with intuitive wisdom, with Boudic Insight, he's able to translate that into knowledge, into the knowledge of consciousness, into the knowledge gained in the psyche and in the physical world. Because music is also physical. So when the music's played, that is very physical. But the meaning, the actual music itself has the psychic quality of a certain energy, a certain feeling level. So when the pianist sits down, they want to attune themselves to the essence of the meaning, the essence of the music. And their goal in playing the music is to translate that music into the sound that Mozart intended. So Mozart intended for that music to emanate what is called the numinosity of the spirit. The numinosity of the spirit. Now the word numinosity was coined by a German professor in the early part of the 20th century called Rudolf Otto in his book, The Idea of the Holy. So he was writing about what holiness is, what wholeness is, and he said the essence of the spirit, the emanation of the spirit that you can experience is called the numinous. And he called the numinous, you might say, the emanation of the holy other, and the holy other is God. So the divine presence in the music, the divine presence in painting, in nature itself, in the very field of creation, in the psyche, in reality, the numinous presence is of the holy other, which is referring to God. So that's the same way the Buddhahood, the God nature, the self nature, the Buddha nature emanates a numinosity, a kind of atmosphere, a divine presence. So you could feel the divine presence when you're walking by the river. You could feel the divine presence in an art gallery, or the divine presence listening to music, it all depends. Or you can feel the divine presence in a personal relationship. So what I'm saying is, the pianist is using they're using their physical body and their consciousness or their psyche to tune into the spiritual numinosity, the essence, what they call the Buddha essence of what they're doing, whether it's a scientist, whether it's a personal relationship, or anything else. In order to deepen the love, deepen the understanding, deepen the compassion, deepen the truth of the music, deepen the sense of ethical justice, you have to tune in to that. You have to go beyond your body and beyond your consciousness and psyche and tune into the spiritual perceptions, so that when people listen to you playing the music, they too can feel the quality of the numinous presence of the holy other, or be awakened to their own Buddha nature. So while they're sitting in a concert, in a sense, the one, the self nature, the one, the Buddha nature, is already within each person, but they may not be awakened to that level. They may be conditioned by society, conditioned by education, not to pay attention, not to attune to their deeper level feelings of love, deeper level feelings of compassion. They've grown insensitive. People are insensitive to their own nature. I mean, another term for what we're saying is, in the sense of karma, is work on yourself. If you want to get anywhere, you have to work on yourself. You have to develop whatever it is you want to develop. So if you want to develop your body, you want to develop your mind, you want to develop your emotions, you want to develop your intellect, you want to develop your sensitivity, all depends what you want to do. But in terms of consciousness and the world, the human condition in society, then that would be work on your karma. And work on your karma is getting things right. And that's the Buddhist Dharma, that's the law. That's the spiritual law that's emanating within your psyche and within the physical world or your body. So again, the one, the Buddha nature, God, is a living fact within you. Whether you're aware of it or not, it's a living fact within you. And if you at a certain age, like myself, at the age of 23, I'd been to university, I studied philosophy and comparative religion. The education, or just the process of education, didn't suit me. I wanted to just be on my own and you might say, just experience life. I remember that was the key word. I just wanted to experience things for myself. But I had no idea of spirituality. I mean, I wasn't brought up religious. I had no spiritual understanding. I didn't know about developing yourself. I didn't know about the psyche and other realms of altered states or astral or God or nirvana. I didn't know anything about that whatsoever. And at the age of 23, however it happened, I was awakened to my self-nature. So I was awakened to the one. So something awakened me to my self-nature. So from that moment on, I've been aware of my self-nature, what's called the one mind or the one. And then you can say, that's God, that's the absolute, that's the ground of being, that's what they call the all foundation. So it's the ground of everything. So the one is the one. So what I'm actually saying is, in this particular talk, that when the word God is mentioned, then in Western society, God is somewhere else. God is outside the universe. God is the creator of the universe and somewhere else. Now, I agree in terms of Tibetan Buddhism that the one mind is what is referred to as Transcendental Wisdom. So when the Buddha was awakened, he left his body and went to a place called Nirvana, the resting place. So I admit that there is a transcendental aspect to the Buddha nature, the God nature, the self nature. But also that the one is also right here now. So without leaving your body, without going outside of the physical universe or outside the psychic universe into the spiritual dimension, the actual spiritual dimension of the one is right here now, and it's in everybody. It's actually a living fact in everybody. And that's what they say in Zen Buddhism. You clear away the dust and the dross from the mirror, and you can see your true face reflected. You can see your self-nature. And they say, once you discover that, you realize that you've known it all along. You've always known it, but you forgot it in your consciousness. When you're born, you forget it. But as a child, you're kind of in that self-nature. The child's face is the original face, as it were. And by some means of self-deception and conditioning, we lose awareness of that. We lose our spiritual awareness, and we've become conditioned by the psyche, by thought, and by the physical world and sensations. And so they're saying it's the most simplest thing in the world. It's the most obvious thing in the world. It's the thing that we overlook. And the task of meditation is to unveil the original face, unveil your self-nature, which is a living fact. Now, if the spiritual perceptions are living facts within you, they're living, they're not attached to they're not in the body, and they're not in the psyche, so they're not in your consciousness, because consciousness is what you might say, consciousness is where we think, where we have our memory, and you could say the consciousness is in the psyche, but it interfaces with the body. So when you're walking around, as it were, and thinking, the thinking itself, the thought coming from the psyche, being a substance of the psyche, somehow works through your body, but your thought is not actually in your body. Whereas a materialist would say your thought, your consciousness, your psyche is actually in your brain. But Carl Jung said that your psyche is probably in coincidence with your brain, but it's not attached to your brain. So you could say there's a gap between your psyche consciousness and your brain. And I agree with that. I think they're in synchronistic coincidence. And also that the spiritual archetypal realm is in coincidence with both the psychic and the physical. So they work synchronistically. So the archetype works synchronistically to connect itself to both the psychic and the physical, and brings the psychic and the physical into some kind of order and rapport in a meaningful coincidence. So the ego, identity, is what we're conditioned to know. So when we grow up as children, we may be in a spiritual dimension, and then we learn the language and we begin to name ourselves. So we become the son and we're given a name. And we identify with that name. And if we learn the piano, we become the pianist. And then we become the student. And then we become the father or mother, etc. So that's quite easy to see how the natural self of the child, the self within the child, as it were, then loses its how can I say, it doesn't become conscious, because it's not about consciousness. The self is in the one. It's not in consciousness. It's not in the psyche, it's not in the body, and it's not in consciousness. So you could say, when the child's running around in a kind of freedom of mind, it's not very conditioned. And then when it becomes conditioned by the environment and conditioned by their character that they've inherited, or they inherit, say, the gift of music. So like Mozart, he started playing music at a very early age. And so he grows up with the identity of Mozart, the musician. And he is not referring to his self. So when he's playing the piano, he's around the house, he goes out into the world, he's an identity called Mozart playing the piano. And that's what most people take to be their self. So someone like Freud, who more or less in the 20th century made the ego a very important complex in psychology, he said the self is the ego. Therefore the self is material, thought is material, ego is material, and there is no the self is reducible to a material process. And also Krishnamurti thought the same thing, that the ego, the identity and the self were the same thing. And in order to go, you might say, deeper into meditation, you had to put aside consciousness and the ego self. So in a sense, he's proposing, in order to go deeper, you have to negate the self. So when he says that he moves out of the material body, as it were, and goes into what he calls the universal mind, there is no self. So Krishnamurti said that he, Krishnamurti, he himself, has to be eliminated. So consciousness has to be negated. Krishnamurti, his history, his personality, everything he knows about himself, everything other people know about Krishnamurti, he said there is no Krishnamurti, there is no self. I would say exactly the opposite. I would say the deeper you go, the closer you come to your true self. And the ground of being, the ground of your true self is the one. and the one is emptiness. And the one is beyond the physical universes and beyond the psychic dimensions. It's beyond all of reality. So the one is the one. So you can leave, when you die, or you leave your body before you die, like Buddha, and you go into the one transcendentally, then when he returned to his body, he was still one in his body. So he leaves the transcendental dimension, but he's still one in his body. He's still Buddha. He's got the Buddha nature. The name Buddha means the Buddha nature, just like Jesus became the Christ. So Christ is exactly the same thing, the God nature. So Buddha was a true self. Buddha was in the one. He used his spiritual perceptions of compassion and love and understanding in the world. And in ordinary relationships with his family and his friends, he would use his consciousness. So to his friends, he would be just like anybody else. He would have an identity. He would be known as the Buddha or whatever, just like people knew Jesus as Jesus. Jesus went to people's houses, he had a meal, he talked to people, all of that. So Jesus, the man, had an identity called Jesus. But in his true nature, he was the Christ. And he used his spiritual perceptions of love, understanding, truth. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, which is the same thing. So why do people like Krishnamurti and other Buddhists and Advaita non-dualists, why do they emphasize the ending of thought, the ending of thought being equivalent, in a sense, to the ending of self? Why would they do that? Why would they think that? Why would that be the case? Now, the point being, for me personally, if you enter, as the Advaita say, pure consciousness, so instead of saying the one, they say, or spiritual awareness, they say pure consciousness. In pure consciousness, there is no self. Then what is if the person talking about Advaita meditation, they've been awakened, they've realized pure consciousness, and they become a spiritual teacher. So you see them on YouTube and they're teaching Advaita, and people go to see them and they give talks, and they're talking about that they're pure consciousness. They're in a body, but they're pure consciousness. And yet you know their personalities, you can see their personalities, they speak in a certain way, they have a certain name, and they behave, they tell jokes and all of that. They've got a personality. They use their, you might say, ego-bound or identity-bound consciousness in that sense. But beyond that, they have no self. Then how can they function in pure consciousness, in emptiness, without a body, without a faculty, without a sense of self? Then what would that be? How would that be? And it seems to me And this is what Krishnamurti is saying as well. He's saying there is no Krishnamurti, there's just this pure mind beyond the physical universe, beyond the body. When you die, or when you leave your body before you die, you can go into this universal mind, which is exactly the same. He said cosmic consciousness. So it's exactly what the Advaitas say, pure consciousness. Then what is in that one mind, when you go into the one mind, what is it that goes into the one mind? If you give up your personality, your identity, yourself, then what is it? Who's speaking? When you speak about it, and you speak about being in the one, in the cosmic consciousness, in the universal mind, as you're speaking to people in his dialogues with David Bohm, in the ending of time, this series of dialogues called the ending of time, Krishnamurti actually talks about being in this one mind as he's talking, and yet he's not in his body, he's in this one mind, he's using his body to talk, and he's saying that the universal mind that he's in, this emptiness, is actually making, is causing the conversation. It's not him as a personality, as Krishnamurti or anything like that. He said there is no Krishnamurti. So in effect he's saying this mind that he is speaking through the body, a bit like a medium. When mediums go into altered states, then a voice speaks through their body, and the voice says, you know, they're so-and-so from the past, or they're speaking, they're channeling something from a different dimension, or they're channeling something from an ancestor or somebody that died, that kind of thing. Well, Krishnamurti was known to leave his body, and the people looking after him would say that his body was speaking to them and said, don't worry, we're looking after him, we've taken him away, we're looking after him. So there is definitely this sense that within Krishnamurti there was a mediumistic personality. So I think what's happening with Krishnamurti is that in fact you might say this is just what they call an alter, or an alter ego, that he's just becoming the wise man and saying that there is no Krishnamurti because this other entity is taking over. So it's this other entity that is just another personality through self-deception that Krishnamurti is associating with, that's speaking as if he has all this knowledge about reality in the universe, but in fact it's just a mediumistic personality. He's just channeling that particular thought process. And I feel these people in Advaita non-duality that said there's no self, I think they're also deceiving themselves, and they are themselves, they are their personality, and they're pretending that they're not. Why they would do that, I have no idea, but I think it is about self-deception. I think people want power and influence, and they can play that game of deceiving people. They can play the game because they're charismatic, they're very persuasive, they have a following, like Krishnamurti had a very big following. He was chosen as the world teacher by Theosophy, and he played that role, and he got away with it. So it is about self-importance, it's about power, and it's about influence and authority. Because to me, there has to be self at the very essence of the human being, at the very essence of reality. Because we're aware, you might say, in one sense, reality is known to self. Reality is known to self through the one, through spiritual perceptions. And the one is the self. I mean, I may be wrong. I mean, it may be possible to exist without self. But in all my inquiries of 50 years and being in many, many different levels, I would have to say that the people that claim there is no self are actually undergoing self-deception. But more than that, I think they're deceiving the people around them. And they're basically either mediumistic or they're in some altered state or dissociated state, what Jung would call a complex. And he studied, for his PhD in psychiatry, he studied his cousin who was a medium. And he said this young lady, only 20 years old, would go into a trance and she would talk like a philosopher. She would, because she had read books and everything, she kind of got all this knowledge and was able in a trance to sound like a great philosopher. So I'm saying that's exactly what these people are doing, like Krishnamurti, Advaita, those people that say non-self, that they're actually taking on a different complex or personality within themselves, and they're identifying with a tradition that believed in that too. So that tradition, wherever that tradition of non-self came from, which is in Zen, which is in Buddhism, which is Advaita, Non-Duality, etc., that tradition, you might say, is based on self-deception, and it's based on, you might say, that, you might say trick, you might say deception, of a mediumistic personality that sounds very intelligent and seems to attract other people who want to believe that. For some reason they want to believe that there is no self. Now it's interesting that the atheists and materialists, those scientists and such, they believe that in a sense there is no self. So they see that all there is the material body and the brain runs on thought, and the brain runs like a computer, a biocomputer, and there is no self. That's an illusion. And so these people are saying exactly the same, that the self, the ego, etc., is an illusion. And I'm saying there's a difference between the invention of an identity, a personality, which is an invention of your thought, and the true self. The true self is not an invention, it's not an identity, it's not made up of language, it's not made up of personality or persona, it's not a mask, it's not phony and fake. It's actually the true nature of not only, in a sense, one's life, the true nature of your life, but the true nature of reality. So in nirvana, in emptiness, there is the body of wisdom, the diamond body. So it's saying that you do have a body in the one. And if you have a body, you have perception, so you have the spiritual perceptions. You have the spiritual faculties. So more or less, when you're in a physical body, you see the world. When you're in a dream body, you see the dream and the psyche. You can travel around, astral travel, see entities and all of that. And when you're in the spiritual body, you can see the way you see. So you might say, as I sit here now, I'm looking at the world around me with my eyes. I'm looking at my thought, my personality, the images and ideas in my mind, in my psyche, consciousness. And I'm also seeing the oneness around me with my spiritual perception, with the third eye. I'm seeing the oneness, I'm seeing the emptiness all around me. So I sit here with my sensory awareness and see the castle. I sit here with my consciousness and name the castle. That's a castle, that's a flag, that's a tree. I'm using my psyche, I'm using my thought, I'm using my consciousness to identify the names of everything. And then with my spiritual perception, I can see the beauty. So seeing the beauty as an objective spiritual perception, I'm seeing the emptiness of the one that's all around me and enfolding the world I see as a spiritual perception. And that's a fact for me, that is a fact. So all those three levels are working right now, and that's a fact. I'm myself, I have an identity to myself. In other words, I have a personality, I have a past, I've written books, I was brought up in Oxford, etc. That's my identity, my personality and my consciousness. And I have spiritual perceptions of the one. That's my spiritual nature, that's my true self-nature. So if I leave my body, if that happens to me at some time, then probably I could go into the transcendental dimension. And when I die, maybe I'll go there at that time. Because I think once you're in the one, then you're always part of the one. Once you discover your true nature, once you discriminate between ego consciousness and identity and your true nature as the one, then you will always be one. And what they say in the Bardo Tadol, the Book of the Dead in Tibetan Buddhism, when you die, they say keep your sight on the clear light of the one mind. Go towards the clear light of the one mind. So I assume that those people who are awakened to their true self go to the clear light of the one mind. If you don't, and you still are identified with your personality, then you get drawn down and you're reborn in a physical body. That's what they say. So I assume if you discover your true nature and you're one, then you will go to the ground of your being. You'll go to the all foundation of reality, which is the one. So I'm adamantly against the idea of denying the fact that there is a self.